Jennifer, in welcoming you to today's webinar on the ethical representation of human trafficking. And I'm Marian Mueller, the chair of the Education Working Group for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. And I'm going to begin our time together with a short prayer. God, Holy One, we pray for all those who are exploited and forced into trafficking. Grant them protection, safety, and empowerment. Restore their dignity and provide them with a new beginning. Show us how we might end exploitation by addressing its causes. We ask you to bless Kelly and Samantha in their work. And we ask you to bless all they love and care about. We pray for each of us on this webinar that this time together will empower us to address the reality of human trafficking. Amen. So just a few items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and you will be sent a link to the webinar in a few days. And during the webinar, you'll be muted and in speakers only mode. However, we do value your input and any questions you may have, and these will be addressed during the last 20 minutes or so of our time together. So to pose a question or a comment on what is being discussed, please use your Q&A box. Also, you want to be on speaker's view in order to see the PowerPoint slides throughout the webinar. And so I'll hand this over now to Jennifer Reyes-Lay, the Executive Director for U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and who will introduce our two presenters. Okay, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And thank you all for joining us today for this important webinar. I am thrilled that we are going to be diving into these topics together today. With U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, we are constantly wanting to engage best practices when it comes to the variety of work we do related to ending human trafficking and supporting survivors. And we want our members, to have information about the best practices as well. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be learning about today, is when we do this work to help prevent and end human trafficking and support survivors. What is the language that we're using? What are the images that we're using? How are we going about this work in ways that honor the lived experience of survivors and don't try to take advantage of that or sensationalize that for our own profit or gain or work. So I am thrilled with the two speakers we have lined up today to share their wisdom with us all so that we can do this work better together. Our first speaker that we'll hear from today is Samantha Searles. She is the program manager with the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center. Samantha's education and advocacy work with IJPC focuses on breaking down the unjust systems of human trafficking and immigration. As part of her work to end human trafficking, Samantha chairs the Public Education and Awareness Committee of End Slavery Cincinnati's Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition. Samantha has her Master of Social Work from Washington University in St. Louis and her Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Indianapolis. Prior to her time at IJPC, Samantha served as a community organizer, working on environmental, economic, and social justice issues, both in St. Louis and in Cincinnati. Please join me in welcoming Samantha.
Thank you so much. I find myself nodding along to my own bio. I'm like, yeah, that's right. good afternoon to those of you in the Eastern time zone and the Central time zone, and good morning to those of you out on the West Coast. As she said, my name is Samantha Searles, and we are here today to talk about the ethical representation of human trafficking in education and awareness work. So a little bit more about me. As was mentioned, I chair our local committee on public education and awareness because of my role at IJPC, where I do public education on the issue of human trafficking and lead advocacy campaigns as necessary to end the atrocity of human trafficking. But in my role as chair, I had the honor of co-creating this content I'm about to share with you. It's actually an excerpt from a longer presentation called Words Matter: Language, Imagery, and Storytelling in Human Trafficking Awareness. So if you are inspired by today's topic and want to learn more, there's actually an interactive activity that goes with this material that we could do on a separate webinar with other groups that you're connected to. So my contact information will be at the end. I just want to start by saying that as with any presentation on human trafficking, this is going to include some content that may be sensitive to some people. We'll include examples of language and images that describe or depict people in stressful situations of harm, bondage, and distress. Especially this presentation, we're talking about what not to do. And so we will be sharing some graphic imagery. And so Kelly and I are going to do our best to try to give warnings before we share those examples so that you can prepare yourself and allow yourself to take care of yourself. And as always, we just encourage community care and support for anybody who's activated by this content. And in my slides specifically, I put a little caution symbol right before that information. So want to get you close to your keyboards and answer this question in the chat. When you hear the phrase human trafficking, what other words or phrases come to mind? You can go ahead and put that in the chat now. When you hear human trafficking, what other words or phrases come to mind? I'm going to see if I can open the chat box while I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully it doesn't block anything. Exploitation, slavery, force, fraud, coercion, abuse, violence, captivity. Thank you all. So that's exactly what I think of. I think of the phrase modern day slavery. I think of the words rescue and save. I think of, and recover. I think about prostitution in relation to human trafficking. And I also think about the word or phrase kidnapped. Now, similar question, come to the chat. What images come to mind when you hear the phrase human trafficking? What do you picture when you close your eyes? Powerlessness. What imagery? Youth, children or adults working in fields, mines, bondage, young children, people of color, poor people. Vulnerable people, crying. Thank you. So we're all kind of on the same page. I think of barbed wire. I think of duct tape. I think of chains and physical restraints. When I think about imagery, I usually think of crying women who may have bruises. I think of shadowy figures. And sometimes I even think about a dirty bed or an image of someplace dirty and scary. So these images and these messages are put out there on purpose for lots of reasons, and they come from lots of different sources. They come from the mainstream media and movies and documentaries because human trafficking is such a heinous act that it is really good content for entertainment purposes. So because these stories are often told through those mediums, we get the imagery associated with that. Sometimes there's viral Facebook posts that talk about human trafficking. There's an example of one on the right about a post that went around with zip ties on car side mirrors. And there was also another viral Facebook post a while back about the Wayfair Furniture Company. So these images and this language is perpetuated by social media as well. And I want to preface, I should have said this earlier, this presentation is meant to challenge you and to challenge the norm of how we do public education and awareness when it comes to human trafficking. I don't mean to call out or shame any long-standing organizations that have done great work on ending trafficking. I just mean to challenge us all to look at the language and the imagery that we use to see if we can do it in a better, more trauma-informed way. So when I mention major anti-human trafficking organizations, that is a place where we receive some of these messages. And even people in authority, law enforcement or other figures who are involved in the anti-human trafficking movement often use these phrases and use these images in their work. And these messages are used, like I said, strategically. They're meant to evoke emotion out of people, specifically to develop sympathy for people who are being harmed. It's also, in my opinion, used to scare the public into being more vigilant to your surroundings, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just listed as one of the reasons why these images and this language is effective. Sometimes it's used to sell papers and movie tickets. Like I said, it's a very gripping topic to cover in entertainment. Sometimes major trafficking organizations use these images and this language to solicit donations and to get people to support their mission, which, again, I'm not passing judgment. It's just the reason why they're used. And unfortunately, recently, this imagery and these language, these words have been used to aid or harm political campaigns, and also define who is worthy of help. You know, when we close our eyes and we picture a victim of human trafficking, and we specifically picture someone who's white and someone who's a woman, that defines in our mind that that category of people don't deserve to be harmed and therefore need our help. So even subliminally, the messages that pop up in our minds defines who's worthy of help. And of course, anytime I talk about trafficking, I have to put a photo of Liam Neeson on here, who was the star of the movie Taken, which shaped a lot of America's consciousness on human trafficking from a few years back. So if you haven't gotten the answer to this question, the question of, are these messages accurate? And the answer is no. So let me give you an example of the harm that bad messaging and poor imagery can cause. Many of you may be familiar with the story of Cyntoia Brown Long. She is a survivor of child sex trafficking and has gone on to write a memoir or an autobiography about her experience, and is a real advocate as a survivor leader. So I want to show you a short clip from an interview she did with Trevor Noah from The Daily Show on Comedy Central. And she explains how this imagery and language affected her. I'm going to switch tabs. Hopefully you can still see this. I'm going to make it full screen. I have the closed captioning on. Hopefully it'll be accurate and helpful. Sometimes closed captioning is finicky. But we'll just watch a little of this.
One part of your story that is particularly powerful and complicated is when you talk about your relationship with the idea that you were involved in sex trafficking. And it's really, really gripping in the book, because you say you didn't consider yourself to be part of sex trafficking in any way. You know, there's a passage where you say, I thought of sex traffic victims as people who were in suitcases or stuffed into containers and chained. And yet I thought I had a boyfriend, when in fact this was your pimp who was making you do what you were doing in the world. Is that part of the problem that we face in dealing with sex trafficking? Is that some of the people who are involved in it don't think of themselves as being victims in the situation?
Absolutely. You know, if you can't identify, you know, victims when it comes to some of the people who are supposed to be saying, you know, this is child abuse. I came across a study where I think it was 57% of mandatory reporters, where these are counselors, these are teachers, these are people who are in constant contact with youth. They're supposed to report every instance of child abuse, and 57% of them thought that some teenagers willingly prostituted themselves, thought that some teenagers traded sex for shelter, for food, because they did it, they consented. And that's just not the case. That is abuse, that is exploitation. And these individuals aren't reporting it. And if you have them saying you're not a victim, you're actually willingly doing this, why wouldn't I believe it? And so for so long, I thought I just consented. I was just promiscuous because that's what I was being told by society. And so it took for a campaign from a group in Tennessee called End Slavery that, they stressed that there's no such thing as teenage prostitution. I didn't know anything about the federal statute that said anyone who's a minor, it's actually a trafficking victim. There's no such thing as consent. And, that was hard to kind of face. I used to argue with people when they said, you were taken advantage of. No, I wasn't. I knew what I was doing. And that's just not the case.
It's really hard.
After the presentation, if we do a follow-up, I'm happy to send a link to that full interview because it's really revealing about how she didn't identify as a victim of human trafficking because of the messages that she received. And so this is a little review of human trafficking 101, but we know that trafficking looks a lot like coercion and manipulation and promises of love, grooming over time, deception, broken promises, and people who've been exploited because of their vulnerabilities. We're not saying that it doesn't look like physical restraint or shadowy figures or people crying, but more accurately, because of the statistics, trafficking is a lot more subtle than that. And so if we show these images of this graphic story, folks like Centoya don't see themselves if that's what's happening to them. And so it's really important to tell a more accurate story. However, even though we want to tell a more accurate story, we want to make sure that the phrases and imagery that we use, even if they're more accurate, still respect the experiences and stories of survivors and doesn't re-traumatize anyone. So yes, the imagery that we use is inaccurate, but we also want to make sure that it is sensitive and trauma informed. So how can we do this in a more accurate and dignified way? Well, let me share another clip with you really quickly. It is from an international organization called Freedom United based in the UK. They have a really gripping campaign called My Story, My Dignity, and it is a campaign for media to tell more dignified stories on behalf of survivors. And so this is their campaign video that we're going to watch. Again, the closed captionings are turned on, but some of these folks have thick accents and it doesn't quite translate into the captioning, so I do apologize.
My feeling about the stories that the media portray about survivors of slavery has been a bit of a mix. I've seen really some good stories that have come out of survivors of slavery in a manner that support the cause of fighting human trafficking, global slavery. But also, I have seen some media houses that have not respected the survivors.
When we keep using images like duct tape and kidnapping and, handcuffs locked in rooms, we're painting a picture for the public that only shows the 5% of victims of human trafficking and the 95% of us, those of us who were lured away from our family and friends with false promises and then kept there using coercive and fraudulent tactics. Those victims walk amongst you and they never get noticed. When media outlets and news sources use terms like child prostitute instead of sex trafficked victim, it really evokes a different type of emotion from viewers.
I challenge all the news outlets and media to start representing the issue as it actually is. Human trafficking is sensational enough without using images and language that brings to mind something from out of a movie versus what it really looks like in your area. Don't make it look like it's something it's not.
Sometimes it feels like you just want my story and that is it. You are not sensitive to the trauma that the person has gone through and how you have you have to manage it. So I would like to see media houses respecting the stories of survivors, and if they want some privacy,
because these stories are real, this is their identity, and by taking away that, by not handling their stories with dignity, you are taking their dignity away again.
some of the media houses have come to me. They will prepare me in advance. Sometimes they will even give me a heads up and just let me know that whatever it is, whatever I want to say, I can say. If I don't want to say something, I'm free not to say something.
Some people, when they interview you or they ask you these questions, they doubt you, they ask the wrong questions. And as a survivor, you continue because of your belief that telling your story will change the world. Think about your worst experience. Now think about reliving that experience every single time someone asks you about it. That is what victims of trafficking and survivors like me have to go through when we tell our stories.
So again, I'll make sure you have the link to this video. There's a petition that you can sign as an individual, and you can read the text of the petition on the website. You can also see the guide for media houses and different tips on what to do to tell a more dignified story. So basically, what we want to do is, instead of focusing on the graphic details of someone's experience, on the suffering and abuse and the trauma that they experienced, let's talk about their resilience, the strength that they have, the hope that they have for the world, what work they're doing now to end human trafficking and prevent others from being harmed. We need to focus on what we can do to end this in the first place, instead of dwell on all the graphic bits, because sometimes the story just ends there, and we need to be more nuanced about how we talk about human trafficking. And also, when we cover stories of trafficking, it is often focused on the voice of the person who's been harmed, but we should also switch some of the narrative to talk about how this happened in the first place, to talk about the traffickers, to put some of the responsibility of ending trafficking back on them and the systems of exploitation that allowed that exploitation to happen in the first place. Later, you'll see some examples from my co-presenter, but I wanted to show you a few here of good imagery when covering human trafficking stories. So just really quickly, the one in the upper left-hand corner is just a picture of a crowd crossing the street, and it looks like everyone's going to work. You could use a photo like that if you're covering a labor trafficking story. There's a picture of running water. There's a sewing machine if we're talking about textiles. There's a photo of a grocery store if we're talking about the farming industry. And if you've noticed, none of these photos have people's faces in them. And there can be an argument for why that's important to humanize the issue, but also it limits our imagination on who can actually be harmed. And so by showing photos of objects, of things that relate to people's lives, we'll be more effective in telling our story, because you'll realize, oh, I go to the grocery store. I could be connected with this story. When talking about children who've been trafficked, showing faces of children is very traumatizing for a lot of different reasons. And so showing objects that represent childhood is a better way to go, like a swing or a shoe or a playground. And then I see this a lot when we talk about online sex trafficking. very scary graphics and whatnot, which again is meant to scare us into being vigilant. But just a photo of a computer and working from it can connect us as well as to, oh, I'm on my computer every day. So just to wrap up my portion, because I know I'm getting close on my time, here's some next steps for you. We need, as a movement, to educate ourselves and focus on marginalized and oppressed groups that don't get the attention they deserve. We need to learn about and talk about how trafficking specifically affects the Black community, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, folks who are LGBT or Latinx, folks living with disabilities, and immigrants and refugees. Those are the photos, those are the images we need to come to mind when we hear human trafficking if we want to be comprehensive in our response. My organization, the Intercommunity Justice and Peace Center, worked with the Public Education and Awareness Committee to put together some messaging toolkits. You can find that on our website under our Human Trafficking tab. If you want to learn more about my story, my dignity, the Freedom United's website's on your screen, as well as some introductory information on how to provide trauma-informed care and do trauma-informed education like we are doing today. For you personally, you can challenge yourself to do better. There was a photo of a chain link fence on IJPC's website until about a year ago, after we had created this content. And so just simply changing one image on your website or rephrasing something on a pamphlet makes a difference. Review your materials, evaluate them. If you get a request from the media to talk about a human trafficking story, practice and think about what kind of sensationalized questions they may ask so that we can tell a better story. If you're working with a survivor and wanting to share their story, provide compensation. They just were exploited for their labor, and now if we don't provide compensation, we're exploiting for their emotional labor yet again. If you see something problematic or framed poorly in your local newspaper, respond through a letter to the editor. Actually, I have some examples in that toolkit that I mentioned in the slide previously. And don't be afraid to hold people and organizations accountable to do better. I know we all are working to end human trafficking, and it seems hard to challenge people who have been doing this longer than I've been alive. But if we don't hold each other accountable to doing a better job, we'll never shift this narrative. So that's the end of my portion. My contact information is on the screen, and as soon as I finish, I'm going to enter some of these links into the chat for you to have them. Please follow us on social media and join our email list. And my phone number is on there, but I do make a point to say no cases. Please, I'm not a direct practice social worker, and we'll just refer folks, of course, to our local anti-human trafficking hotline. But again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this information with you, and I look forward to continuing our partnership.
Thank you so much, Samantha. That was such a helpful overview. And I know, we probably still make some of those mistakes, as do many of our members. So it was such a good reminder for how we can stay vigilant in what we're producing and how we're talking about this issue. Thank you so much. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker today, Kelly Dorr. Kelly is the Executive Director of Sierra Cares Foundation. She is a survivor of familial trafficking from ages 1 to 14, and her testimony brought charges against her trafficker when she was 15. She currently sits on the Governor's Council as an advisor for 3 states and is a member of the Global Survivor Alliance and Delta 8.7 for the United Nations. She has advised on international issues such as cultural child sex abuse, voluntourism, and orphanage trafficking for the State Department. Kelly also does policy work for the Department of Justice and the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. She's published in the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, titled Estimating the Prevalences of Human Trafficking in the United States. She's also a TEDx speaker, and her video is titled The Intersection of Vulnerability and Trauma. Welcome, Kelly. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you. So it's really nice to be here. And I will bring up my screen as well. Can you see that?
No, I don't think it's sharing yet.
Okay. Just let me know when it comes up, but you might have to hit screen share.
It's allowing all panelists to share, but it's not showing up on our end yet.
Let's see.
There we go. Yep, now it's up.
Working. Okay, sorry, there was a little bit of a delay in our computer, but yeah, and I want to start as, really one of the things that we've talked about, and we talk about across the board is really, the whole hashtag listen to survivors, bring survivors to the table. And so I just really want to say thank you to Samantha and the work that they are doing there, even in Cincinnati, because it is so refreshing, not only as a survivor leader and advocate, but to really work with organizations that we really feel like are actually hearing us and hearing what we're saying, especially when it comes to ethical representation and who we are. So, a little bit of my background, I do a lot more federal work and state work in the past 4 years, helped work on or author almost 60 pieces of legislation, really in regards to child trafficking. But one of the transitions that we're really seeing is that really recognizing, and I'll talk about that a little bit, the differences and really that gray area between when a child becomes an adult and what does that look like. And also too, really talking about some of the things that are unseen. And so I will sort of review a little bit of what Samantha said as well and give some examples of that as well. But really for me, one of the things that I do is I am really hard on best practice and ethical standards for organizations, because we as a movement cannot get any better if we are not really listening to what's happening. And as Samantha said, we've seen examples of, the whole Wayfair scandal. We've seen examples used during political seasons. We are coming out of a season where, we've had to talk about and dispel myths from groups such as QAnon and, and other groups thinking that they know more. And really that narrative makes it so much harder for us, not only as survivors, but for advocates in this movement, because people really don't know what they're looking for. And so for me, it's really recognizing, where do we fill in those gaps and how do we come and talk about the best practice and ethical storytelling and all of that for survivors around the globe. Because we tend to see organizations here in the US that will and are slowly starting to adhere to some of those practices and policies. But I can tell you from doing international work, I have an organization in Sierra Leone. I've done international work in Africa and in Europe. And, some of these international organizations, especially like in Asia and Africa, are not doing best practice because they don't have to follow the same set of standards and procedures. And so one of the things that we really emphasize is that what we hear overseas is really not the same as what is going on here. But we have to continue to hold all of these organizations accountable. So today a little bit, one of the things that I always do is I will always make my slides available. So I know that we have a short time to cover a lot here. And so if there's anything that anybody wants, my contact information is at the end, and I'm more than happy to send the slides to you just so that you have those as well. Before we really get started, I really want to talk about, one of the things that we're trying to figure out, here in the US, but also internationally is really what is the root cause of exploitation? And what we know is it's demand, because without the demand to use people for product, profit, or pleasure, we really don't have the ability to navigate this space, but also to really talk about how do we end it? Because when human beings are using other human beings, for financial gain or for physical gain or anything else. And we're not talking about the inherent dignity of that person or really talking about the dignity that lies within those individuals, then we really aren't going to be able to make a lot of strides here. One of my colleagues and dear friends always says, when there are no options, there are no choices. And so when we're talking about people who are trafficked, we have to really recognize that, while they may have had to make a choice here or there, there really wasn't an option. And so one of the things that I did, and I really wanted people to focus on, is what are the vulnerabilities? And as Samantha said, I saw a couple of people point out that, when they think of trafficking, they think of vulnerable people. And so for me, I wanted to create a graph that really helped people understand the root cause. And really, the root cause of the vulnerabilities is mostly poverty and trauma. And until we understand that and address that, we really can't identify a lot of the branches that come out of it. But also, how do we work on the underlying root system so that we can really enforce, but also create resources so that we can really talk about ending the demand, so people do have actual and livable choices that really represent the inherent dignity that's within them. And so this for me, this representation is really helps to understand, I think, in a greater way of what we're actually looking at. And again, like I said, I know we'll sort of go quicker through some of these slides. And so at any moment, if anybody wants them, please reach out and I'm happy to send this presentation over. Again, going back to what Samantha was talking about, it's not that people don't want to see what's happening, it's that we don't know how to see it. And for an example for me, between the ages of 5 until I was about 13, I reached out to 7 different adults, 7 different people, counselors, doctors, neighbors, people I babysat for, and tried to explain to them in my own words what was happening to me. Because in the time, I didn't know that I was being trafficked. I didn't understand what that even meant. And it was by my biological father. I just knew that what I had been told, which was that God made you for this, and this is what you were born to do. And if you don't do this, other little girls are going to get hurt. And so from a very young age, I took on that responsibility and recognized that if I didn't follow through with some of these choices and really some of these contractual agreements that I didn't even recognize I was making as a child, but took responsibility for as an adult, I didn't really understand what was happening. And so I wasn't able to articulate to people what was happening to me either, which makes it really hard, especially when we're working in the space of children. And so that's why it's really important that we understand and we know what we're looking for. One of the things I always say, we don't look the same. Most of us are in front of you. I actually was a born Catholic. I'm a practicing Catholic now, went to Catholic school. I was being trafficked while I was in Catholic school, went to public school, went through high school, middle school, and was being trafficked because my parents were divorced and I was living almost 2 dual lives. I graduated and I did really well in school. I was one of the top soccer players in the state of Colorado, but really learned how to live and have that duality of 2 lives. And so much of it was because of the inherent, not only brainwashing, but also the trauma bond that I had with my biological father. So again, as Samantha said, most of us were not held in bondage. I mean, I was at church on the weekends. I was in school. I was in front of people. I was a loud and boisterous kid because I didn't know any other way to draw attention to myself. And so, so for me, being a part of the familial trafficking side, I actually helped with another survivor. We wrote sort of a study guide for Shared Hope International on familial trafficking, because one of the things that we are recognizing through data now is that nearly 90% of commercial adult survivors, 90% of them, it started in their homes. It started with child sex abuse in their home or with some sort of force, fraud, or coercion. And so again, these are children that are every day in neighborhoods in front of you. It's not the kids on the street. These kids tend to move into the commercial side of things, and they tend to be the runaways in the foster care system at a lot higher rates. However, we recognize too that we really have to look at the people in our neighborhoods and that are productive members of society and have parents that are known in society as well. So this image here, and this is one, Samantha and I sort of talked about, and really, when you Google human trafficking and child trafficking on Google, these are the first 3 pages of images that come up. And it's no wonder why we don't actually know what we're looking for, or we don't understand it, because we do. We think that it's the poor little African American child, or we think, we're looking at the case even now. Look at the nationwide media coverage of Gabby Petito, who is a beautiful girl in her own right. And really what happened to her was a horrific domestic violence situation. However, we're starting to also see the statistics that in the same exact area where Gabby was found, 721 Indigenous women and girls have gone missing in that same amount of time. And the media doesn't cover it at all. And it's really because, for us, we've romanticized what trafficking looks like, and Hollywood has romanticized it. And so for us as survivors, in order for people like me to be found and be heard and be understood, we have to change that narrative, which means we have to start talking about and having those uncomfortable conversations about these images that are in front of us. Because I can tell you, I was never chained, I was never tied up, none of that stuff. I was given drugs as a child, but really it was more to numb me to participate, not as much as I was like forced to do this because there was so many components of force in there that I wasn't fully recognizing as a child. But none of the images that you see in front of you are what I experienced. So we know that every day in America, people are being bought and sold, and every dollar profit is fueled by human pain. And so again, going back to what Centoya Brown Long was saying, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. And I saw a comment in there that, yeah, the media uses that all the time. We'll see articles of, man arrested for having sex with a child prostitute, man arrested for, for sleeping with a child. And really it's rape. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's exactly what it is. And we have to start calling it what it is and really using uncomfortable terms so that in order for us to see what is really in front of us. And again, what Samantha said, talking about the gender, racial, and income equality that fuels the sex trade. And even using the case of Gabby Petito, we really recognize she came from a fairly, middle-class family and she was a social media star. So she right there already was a story for the media, not like most of the prostituted people that we see in exploitation, where the equality and equity of women, and especially African American women, or especially Indigenous women, are really used twofold over what we're seeing their white counterparts. According to the UNDOC in 2020, nearly 35% of victims were children, and 80% of those were women. And so again, recognizing this is why we have to start that transitional conversation. It's so, we see organizations all the time where they want to rescue children and they want to, save children, because that's something that people can get behind. It's something that they can feel good about. But what we're not talking about is that those children grow up into traumatized adults. And those adults end up staying in the life, or they stay trapped in an exploitive situation because they don't have the resources, or even, like Centoya said, identify as trafficking survivors. I knew I was a child abuse victim. I knew that I was abused by multiple acquaintances of my father. I knew that he sexually abused me. I didn't understand until I was in my mid-30s that I was actually a trafficking survivor as well, due to the components of the case and the way that it actually played out. And so if we don't even understand our own victimology or where we are in this, it's really hard for us to articulate that, especially when working with law enforcement or other groups to get help for what we need. One of the things that we recognize, and this is with adults, 98% of those in the life really who, and then 96% who've left the life, they report having some sort of psychological issue. So you can see this graph in front of you. We talk about depression, anxiety, nightmares, flashbacks. These are adults that have never been recognized as children, but still don't have the resources today to understand what they're going through. And so we see these continual and perpetual cycles of addiction. I mean, we can say without a doubt that the root cause of addiction is trauma, with most people across the board. And so when we really look at these numbers and recognize that 42% of people right now who are survivors and adults have attempted suicide at least once. I can tell you, for me, it's been several times. And honestly, through a lot of therapy. I mean, it took about 40 years for me to not have at least one suicidal thought a day, due to the abuse that happened, or just due to not recognizing my own dignity or seeing my own worth. And so again, like, these are some of the things that we've got to start talking about when we are giving resources out to survivors. It's really getting them to recognize that. And so for me, one of the things that I recognize is that policies and laws must be applicable to the survivors. So in addition, so when I actually figured out that I was a trafficking survivor, I was actually the first female county commissioner elected in my area. And I was also a minority Hispanic. So in a very rural area. So anybody who is watching, please don't do that. And then at the same time, make sure that you're in an area where people respect you, but also you actually understand your own background and your own trauma before you get in and try to jump in and help everybody else. So for me, I was actually put on a panel with the National Association of Counties and we were talking about human trafficking, and I started recognizing and correlating the lines between the abuse that I had suffered versus what they were actually defining. And so that's how, was able to communicate with friends in the FBI and law enforcement. And they were like, no, without a doubt, you would be defying that today. But with that, we need to make sure that survivors are always at the table. And so as Samantha said, not in a tokenized manner, but it also means that we have to make sure survivors are healthy at the table. Because one of the things that we're seeing across the board is a lot of organizations who don't understand trauma, and they just want to say we have a survivor at the table. And so in doing so, sometimes we're causing more unintended harm than we actually are helping in that situation. So again, going back to understanding the linear, psychological, and biological age, Tiana Bien is with Cat Women, is one of the most amazing advocates in understanding this. And really, one of the quotable things that she says all the time, the difference between a child and an adult is literally 60 seconds on their 18th birthday. And that's something that when we are looking at policies or shaping things, we have to understand the biological age versus the emotional age, because just because a victim has turned 18 years old doesn't mean that they necessarily have the ability or the cognitive ability to recognize their trauma. And one of the things that I'm recognizing through the work that I do is really starting to give a lot of grace to people and recognizing the fact that sometimes people who've had something really big happen in their lives, their emotional age tends to stop at that moment of trauma. And so if they've never gotten help with it or never gotten support with it, you may have a 65-year-old woman that you're working with who is really coming from the mindset of a 17-year-old, because that's where her trauma started. And so when we recognize that, it helps us to educate legislators and really create policies. So laying the foundation for contemporary human trafficking efforts, this goes way back to like 1948 and 1949 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And really, we looked at it in other countries. But the interesting thing for me is that in 1979 and 81, at the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination in Women, so CEDAW, we actually in New York City ratified this. It was ratified in 189 states or countries, but not in the United States. So this is something we still have to talk about. How do we define this and understand it, but also address it from a policy level? And that goes into prostitution and trafficking. For me, we talk about terms and words. I don't ever use the term prostitution or prostitute. I say prostituted people, because that to me signifies that there still was not a choice for them to be in that situation, even though they may not recognize it themselves, but recognizing that there could be, again, we've had advocates and survivors say, sometimes there's not a pimp involved. Poverty is just as much of a pimp and creates the absence of choice for many people who are prostituted versus people who are also being forced. And so when we look at some of those different things, we can see where the vulnerabilities exist and why those advantages are not simply there for them to have. Looking forward, so, we talk about, legislation 2020, you guys, we can all just sort of, let's just blow that one off, because not a lot got done, and anything that did get done is either being changed or redone, or it's just a mess. And so, we did a lot of work between 2019 to 2020 in the discrimination of trafficked victims, removing liabilities in some states wage theft crimes. One of the the best pieces of policy we actually did here in Colorado that I'm really proud of is the Right to Work with Dignity Act for labor victims. And really, it really opened up, and there's no other piece of policy like that in the US, but it really opened up prosecution for people in businesses knowingly labor trafficking victims. But also looking, into 2022, we need to, pornography. That's a huge thing. And we've seen stuff across the board. We've seen things going on with multiple agencies working on that, recognizing that pornography is a public health issue. And right now, we know that children as young as 7 to 9 years old are being introduced to pornography, which we know changes them biologically. It changes their brains, but it also accounts for 50% of sex crimes in each state right now being child on child. So recognizing some of those things as well. I know I'm having to go a little quick through this, but this slide to me is probably the most important. What are some of the concrete and must for ethical standards that we can do? And it's really making sure that research is up to date. You guys, Google's not always the expert, and we know that. Making sure that organizations that we're working with have the correct licensing, state requirements, and are trauma informed. Making sure that we have proper training and continual training. Certificates don't make you an expert. And this is why we need to draw on those with lived experience, bringing them in, letting them have a seat at the table. But again, like I said, making sure that they're healthy. If they're coming to speak for your event, making sure that you're meeting their needs. Is there, one of the hardest things for me when I go to speak at events is when I step off stage and there's a line of people and they start just regurgitating their trauma back to me. And really, it's something that I've had to learn to say, okay, I've got to set a boundary. Let me take a step back and I will get to you, or can we connect later? But a lot of survivors haven't had that experience and they don't know how to set those boundaries. And so as an organization, I really encourage you to recognize that and understand that with the survivor. Making sure that we have properly vetted and trained volunteers. You guys, this is so important, because just because somebody feels good about it or they've woken up and it's the flavor of the month for them and human trafficking is something they want to fight this month, doesn't mean that they're in a good situation. And sometimes with volunteers, we find, and you guys, I have a social work degree. I went into social work because I wanted to save people and I wanted to fix them. And so a lot of times people are coming into these situations because there are unhealed pieces of themselves. And so making sure that you have a vetted and properly trained agency that for volunteers to come in. And again, as Samantha said, paying livable wages, bringing survivor consultants in, but making sure the trainings are up to date, because this movement is rapidly changing and evolving, and we are finding out so much. One of the things here in the United States that we don't do very well is that we are very reactionary. So we wait until something happens and then we react to it, especially when it comes to policy and laws. And one of the things that Europe does well is they actually do the data and the research, and they take that data and research, and then they say, okay, now let's create a policy based on that. And so really getting our elected officials to understand, how do we change that and navigate that as well. And then lastly, not using trauma porn to fundraise on. So again, as Samantha was saying, using the pictures of the children that you rescued in your organization. We'll talk about that lastly. This is my last slide, but you guys, first of all, I want to say, if they are a minor, you don't have permission to use their picture in your fundraiser, in your report. No matter what you've done, you have to make sure that there's permission from an adult. And if they're an adult, and just because they've worked with her, you don't have permission. I see survivors across the board who have shared their story on other platforms, and then all of a sudden another platform has their story and it's been changed a little bit, or changed to meet the narrative of whatever that group is fundraising on. Not okay. And that's not something that we really encourage. And we want survivors to know that you need to stand up for yourself and recognize that. So changing the language. You guys, we rescue shelter animals, not people. People have free will. And as Catholics on this site, that's one of the things that we talk about all the time, right? That people are responsible for their healing. And so we have to recognize how harmful language and imagery and what we're using is unintentional, but we have to take accountability and change that. Focus on the fundraising, the housing, all of that stuff. One of the greatest pieces that we're missing right now is housing. We find survivors, we can walk with them, we can give them resources, but we don't have the ability to house all of them. And so one of the other biggest pieces is the long-term secondhand trauma for first responders, so that there's less turnover. There's more trauma-informed response, and just the collaboration in this movement is huge across the board. So with that, I know there was a lot there, and I know that we're getting short on time. My email is here, so if you would like some of these slides, either reach out to either Sister Marianne or Jennifer, or you can email me and let me know. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Let's see, I'm going to go back to standard. If you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. Great, and then we'll come back. So if anyone has questions based on what Samantha shared or what Kelly just shared, please go ahead and write those into the Q&A box. We do have a few minutes to address any questions that came up. I know we got a question about some of the resources and links, and we will be including those in the follow-up email that will include a survey from the webinar and also recording to this webinar. So don't worry about those. We'll be sending them back out to everyone. Yeah, let's just kind of keep an eye here and see. So lots of thank yous coming in to our presenters for their great information today. I want to just leave a space if there are any questions. Otherwise, you know, people feel free to follow up with me, and I can pass along any questions later as well. So we have a question that came in about what is a pornography filter law. Kelly, do you want to address that one?
Sure. So there's actually a couple groups running a couple different pornography filter laws. The one that I actually advocate for and support was one that we just actually passed last year in Utah through NACOSI, so the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. And it really is just making sure that devices that come in actually have filters so that children don't have easier access to getting online and getting the pornography. There is another group going around, and I'm not going to say their name, but the act is called the Save the Children Act. And so if any of you have been following QAnon, you recognize that this is sort of their train of thinking, and it's not actually an ethical bill, nor is it actually constitutional. So this was NACOSI's response to making sure that we actually had legal pieces of legislation, but also ones that other states could change and adapt as well. So we're working on that across the board.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe we could just end with sort of like one sort of reminder or takeaway or piece of encouragement for all of the members, you know, who are working on this issue, who want to make sure that we're doing it in the best way possible in collaboration with those who've been directly impacted. Any sort of final thoughts or, you know, yeah, words of encouragement for those who are listening today as they do this work?
I'll go first. It's okay if you're wrong and you mess up and you're learning. This is work, like Kelly mentioned, that is constantly evolving with new data, new trends. And so grant yourself some grace as you adapt to these changing policies and practices and best practices. So that's my little tidbit, is to grant yourself some grace, but don't let yourself off the hook. We all need to challenge ourselves to do better.
Absolutely. You know, and I think just to follow up on that, it's just recognizing the humility side of it. And, you know, and again, like, we're human and we're trying to do the best we can in a world that is completely out of our control at times. And, you know, and sometimes too, just, you know, give yourself the credit for the work that you're doing as well, because, you know, it's not going to be perfect and it's messy. You know, my husband will tell you that, being married to me for 20 years, like, it's a lot like being, you know, and we don't have you know, we don't have resources for marriage, for survivors who are married or who are parents, all of that stuff. And so we're all just trying to do the best that we can. But I think for me that, you know, I wake up every day and I just say, please grant me the ability to be humble with what I'm doing, and how do I articulate that and really get that out and work in a collaborative fashion as well.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for both of you for your wonderful presentations and for being with us to remind us about all of these really important ideas as we go about doing this work. I want to just thank everybody who's joined us for this webinar as well. We are hoping to have maybe at least one more webinar before the end of the year. That's still in the process of being developed, so just stay tuned for other opportunities for ongoing learning and education. We have our members conference coming up this week, Friday and Saturday, so hopefully we will see many of you there as well. It's going to be full of so many great presentations on lots of important topics related to our work to prevent human trafficking and to support survivors. So we hope to see you there. Thank you all very much. Great day.